and it's a pretty good argument as to which is more important. So it's now, and most important in the book, and most controversial, was what Dick and I called the social issue. Suddenly it seemed as if the entire value structure of the country changed. Skirts on young women went up, hair on young men went down, hard drugs became commonplace. The estimable Dr. Timothy Leary was hailed as a hero for his slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out, which endorsed hard drugs, which scrambled the brains of a lot of young people in America, some of whom ended up very dead. And some of the other issues in play, there's a long list, were abortion, amnesty, bra burning, busing, condoms in the classroom, capital punishment, patriotism, flag burning, gays in the military, illegitimacy, prayer in school, racial and ethnic quotas for African Americans and Latinos, sex education, the sexual escapades of one of our presidents, welfare, draft dodging, gun control, Murphy Brown, and again, if you don't know what that is, you better look it up, homosexuality taught as an alternative lifestyle in public schools, and most important, because people say that neoconservatism is basically a movement that started about foreign policy. Most important is crime. We went through in those years seriously a crime wave where violent crime increased 5, 6, 7 times from what it had been. In my own case, in New York City, my elderly mother was mugged. My father was mugged twice. My son was mugged in New York and Washington. And my sister-in-law, a wonderful young woman who was a methadone nurse in Philadelphia, was murdered in a still unsolved crime. It was no way to live. And those are some of the experiences that shaped my hijira. Now, while this was going on, the far left of the Democratic Party, the so-called radical liberals, the radicalibs, associated with the Democratic Party, a party of which I have been a member all my life, were saying, this was the buzzword, law and order is a code word for racism. I don't know, the guys who were around then will remember that one. Now, most all Americans and most all Democrats understood that you needed law and order. I mean, you can't run a civilization as an anarchy. But among too many activist Democrats, a notion formed, is it Gramsci who said it first, that no enemies on the left. So the far left was saying these outrageous things about crime, and many of the activist Democrats refused to denounce it and consequently became associated with it. And that is one, in my judgment, one very, very good reason why since 1964 the Democrats have only gained a majority of the popular vote once. In 1976, Jimmy Carter barely beat Gerald Ford with 50.1% of the vote. In the meanwhile, Republicans had 3 or 4 big, big landslides, and it is that sticks to the party like glue. They say they're afraid to denounce the bad guys, and they don't want to mess with the activists. Excuse me. Now, in my judgment, these precepts remain in play in 2008. Is that 5 or 3? 5, okay. I came to Washington in 1966 to work as an aide and speechwriter to that quite remarkable man, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And he had heard that I had co-authored with Scammon a book called This USA, which attempted to popularize the results of the 1960 census. Now, that sounds a little weird, but there was a remarkable book written by Theodore H. White, who later became a good friend, called The Making of a President, 1960. And it's a narrative also, and I think it was the first of its kind. It was not a thesis book. And he tells a story of John Kennedy and Bob Kennedy and Richard Nixon and John Mitchell and the whole thing. And then suddenly, in chapter 5, he breaks off the narrative, and he says, he comes up with a brilliant observation. He says, you know, only once every 20 years does a presidential election coincide with a decennial census. Pretty interesting. It never occurred to me, and I don't know how many other people. So he goes out to Suitland, Maryland, which has later become one of my hangout spots because I fell in love with this idea of popularizing social demographics. And he describes it in this beautiful, dramatic prose about how the wheels are spinning on the IBM 680, spewing out data, and then he humanizes them. He says, you go to a caucus in rural Minnesota, and what are they talking about? They're not talking about the economy. They're not talking about agriculture. They're crying, the old people saying their sons and daughters are leaving because they can't, with the mechanization of agriculture, they're all going to the big cities. So that's a data, but he just makes you feel it. And then he says, go to Chicago, to the tracks of the Illinois Central, early in the morning, and you'll see blacks with all their clothes and stuff in a little paper suitcase, but dressed in their Sunday best, sort of blinking as they come off at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, headed for Chicago's South Side and what would become for a while a disaster zone. So I fell in love with that idea of humanizing social demographic data, and I was at that time a publishing partner in a very new venture, and I went into my partner and I said, Dave, I got a great idea. Let's get a poet to do not just a chapter on social demographics, but a whole book about it. And he turns to me and he says, Ben, you know, I've been in publishing for 20 years. That is the worst idea I ever heard. So after a while, we split up, and I went to a remarkable man, my first editor, Sam Vaughan of Doubleday, and he said, I like that idea. It's a great idea, but nobody knows who you are. See if you can find a collaborator. And I went down, Scammon, who had worked with Lou Harris as John Kennedy's pollster in 1960, was then director of the Census Bureau, and I wrote a chapter, and that began this collaboration. And the book is dedicated to my 4 grandchildren and to Dick Scammon, who taught me. Now, just a couple of other items, and then I'll let you go. You all know Bill Moyers. When I came to work on the White House, I was working that closely with Bill Moyers. We were editing speeches for President Johnson, campaign speeches that were to be delivered the next morning, sometimes Friday night till 2 o'clock with a bottle of bourbon. And to the best of my recollection, and I talked to him about it recently, he's going to be on one of our programs, we did not disagree on anything. And now Bill says, I went way to the right, and I say he went way to the left. And of course I'm right, but that's a topic for discussion. And finally, I have the other thing is this: the Democratic Party, which during the Roosevelt era, Franklin Roosevelt, he said we have nothing to fear but fear itself, was an optimistic party. And now you listen to the Democrats, and inevitably they're saying we have a crisis in this, we have a crisis in that. It's gloom and doom. How are we going to manage? And the American people are not pessimists. They are the ultimate patriotic optimists. And that is another reason for the parlous state of the Democratic Party in America today. And when and whether they will recover, I don't know. Whether Barack Obama will win or John McCain, I don't know. Obama has done some wonderful, just by the appearance of a non-white face on news magazines and television shows all over the world. I think he's done a great service. I got to know John McCain during the campaign of 2000, traveling on the Straight Talk Express, which the regulars called Bullshit One, and he is a remarkable guy. He doesn't give a formal speech that well, but I think if he sticks to that off-the-cuff kind of stuff, he can do very well, provided he gets a good, young, and dynamic vice president.
I always learn from Ben. I never knew there was a single Unitarian neocon until today. That's remarkable. It's a great honor to be here with Carlin and Mike to honor Ben, playing the much honored role at AEI of the token liberal. Now, were I to play that role, I could easily point to all the ways in which conservatives and neoconservatives have been wrong about so many things, or to pick up Ben's metaphor about how they've slipped on a lot of banana peels. You know, I could point out they were wrong in their predictions about Iraq, astonishingly wrong in their predictions that Bill Clinton's tax increases would doom the economy. Many of them were wrong in criticizing their hero Ronald Reagan for his willingness to negotiate with Gorbachev. And I could say, I think that the failures, if the failures and arrogance of the liberals, real or perceived, paved the way for neoconservatism, then the failures and arrogance of conservatives in our time, real or perceived, will certainly pave the way for a new progressivism. Now, I could say all this and more, actually believe it, and then Mike and Ben and the audience would brilliantly pummel me and we'd all have a good time. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I love Ben Wattenberg, and I'm here because I have been obsessed with Ben Wattenberg and his work since I was 19 years old. Yes, other people have more normal obsessions. Bill Russell, Carl Yastrzemski, Joni Mitchell, Eric Clapton, Albert Einstein, around here, Ronald Reagan. Not me. As Ben said, I am certain that I own the most underlined, margin-noted, scribbled on, argued with copy of The Real Majority in existence. And since he's here, I got to say, another person I owe a debt to is Mike Novak. I also own the most underlined copy of The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethnics, a book that came out very close to the time of Ben's book. I actually wrote a 100-page study trying to refute Ben's book in college. I fought with it all the way, but it affected me, even infected me, in ways that I will get to in a moment. My college newspaper now has an online archive with which those of us who wrote for it can embarrass themselves. And I ran across the following in preparing for today, something I wrote in January of 1972, and I quote, "Toward the end of the 1970 congressional elections, Richard Scammon and Ben Wattenberg, two former Johnson-Humphrey advisors, produced a book entitled The Real Majority. The political center is where it's at, they said, since most Americans are unyoung, unpoor, and unblack. Street crime and the fear of young protesters are the most pressing issues on the minds of American voters in the 1970s, and politicians who fail to realize this will certainly be defeated. LBJ moderate columnists like John Roach and Evans and Novak beat their centrist drums on behalf of the book, and The Real Majority enjoyed the peculiar American honor of becoming more than a book." And then I wrote a line that I'm sure I thought was really clever at the time. Like Portnoy's complaint, it became an event unto itself. Well, it did become an event. It is still an event. The fresh kid who wrote that review at least was right about that. And who else, Ben, has ever compared you to Philip Roth? Well, yes, it turned out that Ben's analysis of George McGovern's chances in 1972 proved a bit closer to the mark than my own. I'm going to tell Ben a story about The Real Majority and me before we're done, but I want to explain why I love Ben. There are many reasons, but two stand out. The first is that I absolutely love Ben's optimism. If there is someone on this planet more optimistic than Ben Wattenberg, I have yet to find him or her. In fact, I'd actually worry about that person. If Ben's house burned down, he'd say he wanted a new one anyway. If his car broke down, he'd say exercise is good for you. I suspect that Ben is secretly behind Barack Obama's emphasis on hope. And I've always agreed with Ben's emphasis on optimism. Indeed, I believe that a lot of recent political history can be explained by the fact that Ronald Reagan stole optimism from the Democrats and Bill Clinton stole it back in 1992. And a lot this year will depend on who gains control of optimism, which is why I think Obama may be on a sensible track with that word hope. There are many things that